Not everyone can say that their mother was part of an all-woman motorcycle troupe in Vietnam in the 1950s, but Hoa Nguyen can. If you think that it would be the kind of personal mythology out of which poetry could be made, you'd be correct. Hoa Nguyen's latest book is called 1,000 Times You Lose Your Treasure. She's the author of several books, including Red Juice, Poems 1998 to 2008, and Violet Energy Ingots, which received a 2017 Griffin Prize nomination. Born in Vinh Long in the year of the fire horse, Hoa was raised and educated in the United States and has lived in Canada since 2011. A real joy and honor to have you on the show. Thank you, Hoa.
Thank you, Paul. It's my pleasure. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Excellent. Before we talk about the book, I'd like to talk to you about your stance toward poem making. A former student of yours says that the essay Projective Verse by Charles Olson is something you assign to students. And I was wondering if that essay gives us a sense of how you approach poetry composition.
Oh, well, sure. I mean, projective verse was important to me in my thinking about poems as a field. I studied the Black Mountain poets when I was a student at New College. And then I still post, that period, found great influence in the thinking around how poems are made. What do they do? What are the signatures of also like community that surrounds a poem? Those were all deeply informed by that period of time. And in San Francisco, one of my mentors is Joanne Kiger, who I know you've had on this program or have interviewed in the past. And she said that she often read projective verse and thought about syllable seeds, that syllables could be strung on like beads on a necklace. So one gathers, really from many different sources and the ways in which those like sources, change and are adapted, through time. Olson's someone that I've taught the poetry of, the Maximus poems. Most recently in a workshop, we sort of touched on, like, and really sort of like not even dipped into, but just touched the Maximus poems while we were also working with the tarot, which is a symbol system that I'm interested in and had studied for a long time. Anyway, so yeah, projective verse. I'm interested in how a poem, is an energy discharge. That is that at all points, it is moving instanter to new perceptions. And those are really helpful things to think about, what a poem can do or how a poem can feel. The idea of breath being a signature of one's line or one's measure seemed so intuitively correct. When I read it in projective verse, I think probably other people have arrived at different ways of expressing the same thing. But the idea of like the breath line, the page as a field upon which you can move, within which you can move. Duncan is also someone whose ideas about composition by field has also been influential on my thinking about how to make poems. So yes.
When you talk about Joanne Kiger, I immediately think of an interview that was in the book that Cedar Saigo put together about Joanne Kiger. And an interviewer who said he was kind of surprised that she could write spontaneously and not really mess with the poem too much after, that it was pretty much finished when she finished writing it. And he said, that must be very difficult. And she said, no, I mean, you basically, you train yourself to write like that. He says, well, I couldn't do that. And her answer was, well, you can. Very simply like that. And it's easy to say that. And it takes what, 15, 20, 25 years to write like that. But your poems, and there's such surprise mind and such wonderful juxtapositions in them. I'm wondering how much you go back to them after you've written them and tweak them and shape them, or if it comes out as a blast.
It doesn't come out as a blast, although certainly, like I agree with what Joanne Kiger was saying there, that you can train yourself to pay attention to phrasing and melodic cohesions in a way to at least aim your gathering. And so my free writing, or whatever, my spontaneous writing, can indeed contain quite a lot of what then ends up on the page after I decide that it's done. But there is, revision, and I think in particular with this book, because it was also proposing a shape. It was proposing to, tell stories that had particular kinds of content. It also was interested in sort of biography and verse, interested in, archival interactions and other forms of gathering and reportage and investigative and sort of mythic, also many different kinds of attempts, but they were pitched. So I did find with this book, my management of the materials had a new sort of precedence in its making than, say, previous book, Violet Energy Ingots, was more led by my engagements with, thinking with poetry, interacting with the world, current events, external, interior, and so on. So it's interesting. I do think in this book, in this occasion, it was more managed post spontaneous moment of writing than in previous iterations. But yeah, so a mix, I would say. And I think that I do remember actually in a Kiger poem, one of the moments of the poem said something like, I know this sounds spontaneous, but it's actually composed, which is, one can't tell how to take that exactly. Maybe that's a slyness there in the poem, given that she's known to say that she tends not to revise heavily. But I do also remember that she said, that you can overwork a poem, that like bread, you can make it tough. And I've always remembered that as well. And I think there can be like over processing that happens in the revising. And so it's about like touch also.
You're in a very unique position where you grow up and you start studying poetry in the United States, and then since 2011 living in Canada. And of course, I live in a bioregion, Cascadia, that is intersected by the 49th parallel. So we connect with a lot of Canadian poets. I was in your Fred Waugh workshop, for example, and love Fred's work. Daphne Marlett, George Bowring, Sharon Thiessen, Barry McKinnon, the late Peter Cully, many other poets from Canada. What's the difference between the poetry communities in the United States and those in Canada as you've experienced them?
I've experienced them in a very personal way, through sort of my locale, which is, is not in BC. It's in Ontario and here in Toronto, dish with one spoon territory. I found, my arrival here 10 years ago, or now almost 11 years ago, met with a really vibrant community, people who make books. One of the things, I think that's enviable in Canada is it's a collection of small presses that bring out poetry titles, and have these great catalogs. They're also supported by the arts, by the federal government, so that they can also produce really lovely books and have a catalog that extends, across years. In other words, the support for the arts here is really quite extensive in relatively speaking to the US. So I find that people, have a healthy reading life, lots of readership here. It's interesting to see how work crosses the border. I think a lot of times in the US, one doesn't think of, well, the US tends to be a little bit, myopic or, self-centered. So I say this as, someone who's culturally an American, as well as someone who's lived in Canada 10 years. So there is a certain way, like a self-perspective too, of like, what does it mean? What is Americanness? What are Americans' tendencies? That truism that one really learns about, who one is when you leave where you're from. And so that's been quite interesting. It's interesting, as I started to say, to see, how work is exchanged across the border, and you really see that it's about relationships. And so I've always been interested in how relationships are these carriers of culture formation, how they impact art making, how they're necessary, especially as a way to respond outside of institutional formats. And so, so in Canada, the small presses have more institutional support, which is a quite different. So less fly by night, also by comparison, many small presses have brief, bright runs, and then, necessarily, it becomes something else or dormant. And that was sort of the case with my small press, Skanky Possum, which I started in the 90s. We published a few books and had a magazine for a while, but no institutional support. So that's an interesting contrast, and to see what that does around the conversations. And what else can I say about the community here? I mean, I felt really welcomed. I had people start attending my workshops, and finding a formation of community around those. This kind of openness to join. And try this person that they didn't know out to see what I was up to, and really good readers, like readers of each other's work. People buy books, which is always nice. And what else can I say? I feel like the tendency to read sort of within one's communities also is the same too. Like but that Canadians are more open to reading U.S. authors than, say, like U.S. authors, reaching out to Canadian authors. I think U.S. authors don't really think about nation in those ways. They just think Canadians are Americans because they don't think of the differences. So that's also interesting to me.
Yeah, it's fascinating it's fascinating just to cross the border. And often I feel a sense of relief in many ways. Although I have experienced some anti-American sentiment, but for the most part, it seems more relaxed when I cross the 49th, which is really interesting to note. There are photos of your mom in action with a motorcycle troupe, and I'm wondering what role those photos played in the creation of this book.
Well, I mean, they were pretty much everything in the creation of this book, in that, I grew up with these images. I grew up with 4 of the images that are present in 1,000 Times You Lose Your Treasure. The 4 images are one of her troupe, which was called Viet Hung, of 5 women. One's astride a motorcycle, and then she's flanked by 2 others, one of which is my mother. And she would have been 18 in the picture. So, when she was in this motorcycle troupe, it was like what she did instead of going to college. She was in a circus and worked, and, had this local celebrity, was financially independent, because of it, and also like free from the strictures of a very traditional Buddhist family. She lived her life free, to do this thing that's also obviously took great courage and is pretty wild, to think of the risk taking involved and the sort of extremeness of this activity, and certainly uniqueness. So obviously it was striking from the moment, I laid eyes on these images. The other three were one of my mother with her leg on the handlebars of the bike, going down a road with her hand on her chin, looking very elegant and unbothered. And then the other two were her performing inside of the barrel, which is also called the wall of death, which is a cylinder above which the audience circles and can look down on the performers who are circling perpendicularly along the side. My mother could go to the very top of this cylinder, the wall of death, and which is called the red line, and also would have her arms out, which is something that only one other person in her troupe would be willing to do. Anyway, so those obviously were two also very striking images. But the silence around the images was pretty powerful. They weren't really narrated. So because I knew my mother as a waitress, as they were known in the 70s. And she was a career waitress and very proudly American, and English speaker, and had left her Vietnamese-ness as far behind her as she could. Had married a white American who worked for the State Department, and we didn't speak Vietnamese at home, and so I never learned to speak Vietnamese. Although when I came, I was born in Vietnam, as you mentioned. When I came to the U.S., I would have been speaking Vietnamese, but I was still I was 2, so it was impossible for me to really form the whole sentence. But as you know, if you've been around any 2-year-olds, they have command of the whole grammar at that point. But that's a side note that has to do with me and my relationship to language. But the stories around the motorcycle photographs just remained sort of unarticulated. And if I would ask my mother, to tell me about it, she would say, well, that was a long time ago. That was, and then she'd want to talk about something else. There was a lot of deflection. So it took a long time to really even understand their context and to be able to understand what her life was like around them. Because by the time she left Vietnam, she had quit the circus for 6 years. So they really were a long time ago for her. But also it was clear, not only was it a long time ago and another world ago, but there was also a lot of other things around her wanting to leave it behind. And so I couldn't, of course, leave those amazing images unnarrated as a person who always, from a very young age, was interested in writing and in poetry and telling stories. I had kept requesting information, over the years from her. I had the images framed. I remember one time in college, and she saw that I had framed 2 copies of these images and had them on my first apartment wall. She said, why don't you have any recent pictures of me up? It was as though this was another person. And so I started writing the sequence in 2013, but it was a really hard book to write. It's partly why it took me 7 years. I mean, there was a big gap. I wrote Violet Energy Ingots in between. I had set it aside after the first sort of 20.
How did you get the title for the book?
Well, when I first sat down to write the first 20, it was the first time I had any sort of dedicated writing time. I'd always been a sort of writer who had to write while working, because of having too many jobs and raising children. And so I had this period of time that was set aside. I had gotten one of those coveted writing residencies and had a situation where I could actually leave my work situation to take it. And I brought with me to the residency a copy of the I Ching, which is a divination book, very old. The copy that I brought with me was not the Wilhelm, but the Wilhelm was translation was my first edition, which I picked up from a used bookstore when I was a teenager. And so I threw my coins. You know, when you draw your hexagram, you throw coins, and depending on the pattern of how they fall, it relates to a corresponding hexagram. And the hexagram I drew was number 51, Chen, arousing thunder, thunder over thunder. It's shock. It's like chaos. And so I immediately shoved aside the I Ching and my hexagram, and I tried to dismiss it. So then the next day, and maybe tried to write, I don't know what I did that first day, but the next day I threw my coins again, and I got 51 again. And then I threw it again, and I got number 51 again. So, and if you know, like the odds of that are pretty low to get to draw the same hexagram of all the hexagrams you could draw again 3 times in a row. So I realized I had to pay attention to it. And the changing line, which is when you read what the I Ching says about your hexagram, said 100,000 times you lose your treasure. It says many other things, but I found that really resonant. But I also decided 100 is too many times. 1,000 times is plenty of times to lose your treasure. And I tried to stay in consideration of what the hexagram was trying to say. And then I realized, well, of course, like I was born into this really cataclysmic moment in history, you know, which my mother was already living through, you know, in Vinh Long near Saigon in the late 60s. Also, I mixed, so my birth like would have been like an automatic jeopardy for her as a single mother to raise me. So I realized that this hexagram, even though I understood and wanted to be really careful of how I included the history of colonial violence and military industrial violence in her life, I didn't want it to take centrality. But the I Ching let me know, like, no, it's really about looking at how she lived through this cataclysmic structural change. It was her liberation, and her strength was her adaptation to the experience of shock and chaos. So that's where the title came from.
I've had that experience with the runes, and you know, you get a rune 2 days in a row, and it's like, no, go back. It's trying to tell you something. And I think Hagalaz might be the rune counterpart to number 51, the rune of hail, which in it is it's looked at as a seed, not as ice. So a seed for things to develop from that. So interesting how divination and projective verse, for instance, might be related, or composition in general. There's a poem on page 10, The Flying Motorcycle Artist, that really gives some good background to the story. And it's high time that I think we had you read something. So would you be interested in reading that?
Yes, The Flying Motorist Artist. It's the poem that speaks of how my mother, whose Vietnamese name was Diep, how she met a fate when she was a child, in that a circus came to town, and she snuck out of the house. She grew up on this, you know, on a farm in a rural place in Kenta. And the title, The Flying Motorist Artist, is what the Viet Hung performers, what the stunt cyclist called themselves. The Flying Motorist Artist. At 12, Diep didn't have a half-cent entrance fee to see the circus performance. When she was 12, 3 motorcycle performers traveled from Thailand to Kenta. I thought they were from the Philippines. No, Thailand. A motorcycle act that came to her province in the lower Mekong Delta, joining a country fair for the new year, 1954. Everywhere we came to see displays of snakes, contortionists, fortune tellers, to exchange caged birds. She, the disobey, Diep, done with farm chores, washing clothes, seeing to chickens, but never the kitchen. She made things burn or break, they said, spilled rice in the dirt, bad luck, they said, and banned her. Recall that one seer and her mad possession, spirits in the belly, suddenly enlarged, round and hard. When she saw the palm reader, they made tell of a sailboat. Come see the flying motorist artist, riding shadows on the wall of death, riding shadows on the wall of death. Watch them defy death on the wall of death. Danger, perpendicular, their reaching hands. Two men, a lone woman riding her name, loud, loud and loud, motorbike flying, the wooden wall roars.
The flying motorist artist, not motorcycle artist, as I said.
Yes.
Thank you for that. She had some real guts to do something like that. I'm wondering, the thought occurred to me, did she ever get hurt doing that?
Oh yeah. In fact, as it happens, in everyone's lives, the sort of follies of one's youth comes back in later life, like Evel Knievel, when by the end of his life, he had a lot of pains. She fell, there's a story she told me about this big performance in front of then South Vietnam's president, Diem, where they did an exhibition in front of the president, where she fell. But then, because it was the show must go on, like got back up and kept writing, and like dramatically like was bleeding, from the cuts that she had received from her fall. So that was one time that I know of. But another time I know of, and I think one of the early poems introduces it, she talks about having, falling on a part of the bike, I think it was the handlebars, and them digging into her knee, dramatically, removing flesh, having fallen from great heights to the bottom of the barrel with the bike on top of her. So yeah, and she was probably 100 pounds. Yeah, the bike might have weighed as much as she.
Ouch. I crashed my bike last year, not quite a year ago. And oh my God. I mean, and this is a normal city bike riding. So you can imagine what stunt accidents might be like. I'm wondering how you go about assembling a book. It took you a long time to write this one. The time and it really shows. Poets in that way are alchemists or magicians in a way, because they can take all this time and boil it down to an essence. And it really shows in the book because it's incredibly potent. And I'm wondering how you go about putting it together. I think Duncan, who you mentioned earlier, was more into doing a chronological approach. What's your approach?
Oh, well, for this book, not unlike my other books, I think of like a sequence that can open, that feel like the opening. And then I find within the manuscript, the sequence that feels like the hub or the center of the book. And then, sort of the outro, or the sort of way the book wants to, have at its ending sequence. Of course, with poetry, one often is going through a book achronologically, without any sort of order, or at least I do. I don't know. My reading maybe is different from everyone else's. I mean, of course, I also read it front to back, but I was interested in how the book could be read from different points of entry. I was interested in less the chronology, um, but to take on different forms of address, different assemblies of attention, or different ways I've talked about this. And I was also thinking about song and story. There are several ghost stories, in the book, as long as and including, my mother's stories, but I have like ghost stories in there. And I've always loved ghost stories, and I also, of course, I loved music, like many people of music. But I was thinking the other day about how some of my earlier sort of like grade school songs we'd learn, the different songs we learned, the Molly Malone song, the Irish ballad, and the Australian ballad, Waltzing Matilda, and they both have ghosts in them. And I loved them for their like sudden deaths and slightly macabre, materials, but they're like the ghosts that are really animated, within the space of this song. I think there's something about hauntings that is also been a long preoccupation of mine. And when we tell ghost stories or share these kinds of stories, they aren't, they're sort of buoyant and have their own capacities, right? And so just by sequencing them, it doesn't necessarily mean, or maybe going back to that Joanne Kiger idea of the syllables, it's maybe they're more like, arrangements along a necklace. But so I do start with what I think of as the sort of opening structure, the opening sort of strains. I think musically, I also think about the kinds of poems, so that there does seem to feel like, not too many matching poems, to have a kind of variation. Um, so the different sort of points of entry, and the different kinds of poems I was interested in, as I said earlier, to making sure that the storytelling didn't get overtaken by any one perspective. And so, had a had a wall full of my pages, that I looked at every day, um, and would sometimes make line edits on, but also had a kind of flagging system that had colors on them that would let me know what kind of perspective I might be representing, or kind of poem. Like there's some archival fragments that speak in the group of poems, like a language colloquial book of language exercises, um, you know war sort of document materials. But I didn't want that tone, which is quite formal and dry, to overtake the whole. So it was sort of a mapping and a tracking, and in the end, it became also this sort of project that lived on my wall, of which my younger son said that it looked like one of those, you know, uh, one of those detective stories where the deeply invested detective has the whole array of all the suspects that are involved in some mystery. But those are sort of the strategies I adapted.
Well, talk about the ghosts. I mean, that was one thing I picked out as something to talk about. In North America, we tend to not dwell on the energetic, ghosts. I mean, that's, BS, or for, Hollywood movies or something like that. The poem Vietnam Ghost Story, High School Clock Tower, gives us a glimpse of how Vietnamese culture deals with such matters. That's on page 33, as does the poem Feast of the First Morning of the First Day, page 52. But the first one, the ghost story on page 33, might be interesting to hear.
Yeah, this one was shared on a podcast that I was listening to out of Ho Chi Minh City, which many still refer to as Saigon. That was part of the Saigoneers podcast, and it was Halloween. So they were telling ghost stories, and I was like, oh, perfect. I love ghost stories. And yeah, this one is a famous haunting in Ho Chi Minh City. at a famous high school, which I think is known for its colonial architecture, with this clock tower as part of its features, and this particular ghost, who is also, I remember in the podcast they actually have the purple aliyah on like a mannequin in the high school. I think this is also maybe a way of homage, and maybe trying to manage the ghost of this, which is a classic sort of Romeo and Juliet story. Vietnam ghost story, high school clock tower. The cursed object in the high school is the clock tower. The curse arose from a secret teenaged love story and a pregnancy discovered by the families, with many objections and keeping them apart. The clock tower is the site of her pregnant suicide. And now the room inside the tower is kept locked. Mist surrounds the room. A purple aliyah ghost haunts the hallways. A purple aliyah phantom wanders the courtyard, sits under a banyan tree. Sometimes the high school principal places magical amulets and burns offerings inside the room to appease the purple aliyah ghost. And that seems to help somewhat.
I love the somewhat there at the end. You know, I can't help but think, I went to a high school in Chicago that I think was founded in 1908 or something like that. It was an all boys school for almost 70 years. And the clock tower is the iconic part of it. So I can't help but compare this story to my own high school experience, Lane Tech on the northwest side of Chicago, and see the difference between Vietnamese culture and US culture and my own culture. You know, my mother comes from Cuba, and that is a culture that's more open to the energetic, and you know, you talk about Santeria or other traditions like that. So it's fascinating to see that, what I bring to that. And then of course the great ending, somewhat. You can never be sure with the energetic. I mean, you can't see it, so it's a hunch. You've just got to feel it, and we're taught to disrespect that or to discourage that in US culture. So fantastic. I love that.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about how in US culture, really, when it's acceptable is if it's around like sporting events, like the superstitious or appeasing, you know, like the spirits. There can be a culture that's maybe made okay by the presence of a sporting event.
Right. The costumes, people dressing up in face paint or dressing up as a Seahawk or
Having chants.
yeah. In fact, I was thinking about that, the local soccer team. I did go to one soccer game, and it felt like a cult to me. I hate to say it. Maybe if I go more often, I'd get into it, but it was kind of strange. Whenever the average US American thinks about Vietnam, they think about what the war that the Vietnamese call the American War, which I think is a better title for it, except if you say that in this country, they're going to say which one, because it seems this country's always at war. But of course, this is a key event in your life because you fled your ancestral homeland because of it. The poem Napalm Notes gets right to the heart of one of the worst atrocities of that war. And like you said, the poem is very matter of fact, page 17. Would that be something you'd be interested in reading for us?
Yeah, sure. I should clarify that the war certainly was part of the story that put my life into motion, but the circumstances were not dire in terms of refugeeism. You know, we didn't have that experience. My mother and I, we left with her husband, who became my father. And I'd love to read this poem, Napalm Notes. Like you said, it has a tone of formality or matter of factness. I'm trying to find my page. Here we go. Napalm Notes. Developed in secret at Harvard, produced by Dow Chemical, an efficient incendiary formula perfected on Valentine's Day, 1942. A thickened gasoline can be dropped from planes, napalm bombs, also flamethrowers. 8 million tons of bombs in Vietnam burns at 1500 to 2200 degrees Fahrenheit, 1/5 as hot as the surface of the sun. Very sticky, stable, also relatively cheap.
Boom, and there it ends. Very matter of fact, very powerful. Without really getting into emotions, but allowing us the space to bring our own emotions into it, as the most artful poetry is done. How do you know when a poem is over? How can you? I mean, it's like, when anything is over, it stops. You can compare it to many things, but those especially the endings of those last two poems, very potent. It's almost like mic drop kind of things.
By feel, by texture, by seeing to its shape. In projective verse, when Olson quotes Creeley as saying, form is nothing more than an extension of content. And I think about that in terms of feeling the breadth of a poem if it's established itself. The sonic textures, the rhythmic qualities that bring about a sensation of like, okay, this is the shape. There's often these conversations about openness versus closeness, and those can be, interesting ways to think about whether something, takes on a particular kind of shape. I try not to think of in those terms, but think more in terms of a whole assembly or a whole constellation of concerns with regard to how do I know whether something's done. And sometimes the poem will signal that maybe it doesn't know yet that it's done, or which could also mean either it's not ready to be managed more. It needs to be shorter by half or longer by twice, or maybe made into spare parts. There's many different ways in which a poem then might manifest again or permutate again. So, but a lot of it has to do with a kind of feel. The difficulty was as one does, sort of train oneself to write it, to write in ways with these kinds of considerations, is that one can also have sort of signature maneuvers, and so it also becomes a challenge to keep open the possibilities, so that at least that was my experience with this manuscript, to keep open the possibilities and to interrogate whether it truly is the shape that it needs to be in, because there were periods of times in the making of the manuscript where I understood that I wasn't pushing hard enough against form or expression, that it needed to do more. There needed to be some furthering. So, it depends.
How do you use spare parts?
How do I use spare parts?
Yeah.
Well, you never throw anything away, and sometimes when one is in a moment of need regarding, trying to find some, piece of language that can then intervene in a poem that is needing intervention, I'll go through my notebook, or if it's kept electronically, I like the tactility of writing notebooks, so I tend to do that. strategy first, and it kind of makes a difference too, because there are lots of accidental things that happen when you rifle through your own things, when you go back into your own sort of compost, just to bring it into a new possibility. So it might be just a line, um, an image, reuse a title. I know in A Thousand Times You Lose Your Treasure, there's a poem that I actually completed. It was one of the early poems, that first 20 I mentioned earlier, that in the final sort of view of the whole, I made the decision to take it out, but it exists in the form of like one line in one of the poems. So that's one example of how I used a spare part.
I remember that, but I can't call it up out of my memory, but I remember that one line poem.
Hmm.
But
Oh, that one. Yeah, no, that's a different
oh, is
poem.
that right? Okay.
That is a one line poem. But what I said was, the poem that I pulled from the manuscript exists as a single line inside of a poem,
Oh, I see. So that's what it got boiled down to.
recycled as a spare, or
Yeah.
recycled as part of a new configuration.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Michael McClure called these pocket notebooks his paper brain.
Mhm.
Yeah. Because you left Vietnam at a very early age, 1.5, 2 years old, you didn't grow up with Vietnamese culture, yet the book gives us a good sense of some of that culture. How has it been to try and catch up in a way with your mom's culture, with Vietnamese culture?
It's a little vexed, because there's a sense of like kind of dispossession. I mean, obviously, I've kind of resigned that I won't become a fluent, Vietnamese speaker. I actually sort of evidence my resignation in the book in a certain way, because I take this colloquial Vietnamese handbook of language exercises, and I use them in the poems. This was a book that I bought in the 90s when Vietnam first opened to Westerners entering the country, when it was safe to actually go there. I bought them. They came with cassette tapes with the idea that I would learn Vietnamese, and I told my mother about them on the phone, and as we talked about it, she said, that's a northern accent. Like, that's not the right accent at all. So and then it was really hard. Like, I started listening to the tapes. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so impossible. Um, so not having access to the language, that's a barrier. Having to, do acts of translation, is part of it. And also adaptations, and also the recognition, it's like that it's not that it's not really a measure of whether or not I am getting it right or am Vietnamese enough. That our diaspora actually is super various. So part of the gift of becoming more in conversation with that aspect of my roots, is that recognition that the diaspora looks like a lot of different things, that I'm not just this orphan, or one-off. As I was talking recently to a diasporic Vietnamese writer, there's this sensation, I think, growing up, because we each had these very different, kinds of entries into becoming an American who's also Vietnamese, but our own kind of Vietnamese, that we thought we were the only sort of ones. And it's like, no, I think each person has these different expressions. Well, of course they do, but I think because there has been this sort of absence, in terms of my not having a community, and then in the larger expression, the narratives are so monolithic, and they didn't match up with my experience. So I always felt sort of outside of what was supposedly like the Vietnamese diasporic experience. Um, it's been very meaningful. I mean, really, I realized early on that one of a pivotal moment, for me in understanding that I was a poet, was a book that I found in the public library that was translated by Win Bick and Merwin, in the 70s, called 10,000 Years of Vietnamese Poetry. Or is it 1,000 years? I don't, maybe it's 1,000 years. and I'm making it 10,000 because of my book. But anyway, the opening of that book, in the introduction, the introductory words were, the Vietnamese have felt they were always poets. And I was like, okay, I can be a poet. Like I didn't really have like a sign that it was okay for me to be a poet, because all the poets I read that like was nothing, like I didn't have anything in common with. And which I think is one of the reasons I sought out that book, even though it was a book of in translation in English and mostly traditional poems. Um, at any rate, the biggest gift also too is like to be in closer proximity with other Vietnamese diasporic writers. And so I've been involved with She Who Has No Masters, which is part of the Diasporic Vietnamese Artist Network. We're starting a mentorship this year. I'm one of the mentors for our first cohort. We do a lot of collaborative works, and that's been like just a sort of soul nourishing kind of event in my life.
That's fantastic. Page 18, help me with the pronunciation, learning the Don Bao.
Yes. Well, you know, because my Vietnamese is non-existent, I say the words with great approximation and with an American accent. So I actually heard your pronunciation sounded really good to my ear.
Thank you.
Did you want me to read this one?
I would love it. Yeah, we have a fairly decent Vietnamese community here in Seattle. So pick up a little bit and you tell people, no, it's pho,
Yeah.
not faux. And so, you have that, but I like to think I have a good ear. So, but I'm also prone to great mistakes as I did when I said the name of the first poem. But yeah, I'd love to hear that poem.
Okay, great. Learning the Dam Bao. The monocord of Vietnam, typically used for lamenting songs, traditionally sung by blind players. Single string with resonator, empty coconut shell, manipulated by a stick plucked entirely in harmonics, also called gourd zither. Pluck it with some kind of pick. The notes are clear and bell-like, fairy-like, a winged string. Flexing the string, the pitch rises and falls, the notes trill. It sounds like the Vietnamese voice, they say, the pitch bending the way the voice holds sway, bends towards the Vietnamese voice. Old as war, old as epic, a poor person's instrument. With an electric pickup and amp, you can make it sing, Welcome to the Hotel California.
That ending is just so classic. And again, I think of a Cuban experience I had. I had relatives who were on the Mario boat lift, and we started talking about music, and they talked about this song Hotel California. And here I am going, oh, not the Eagles, please, something a little more meaty than that. But you can imagine, you can check out any time you want, but you can never leave, the residence of someone in Cuba with that particular tune, and hearing it on Radio Marti or Miami radio stations or whatever, however they got to it in the pre-internet days. So going to the Hotel California was just knocked me out on that one.
Oh, yay.
Here we are, 51 days into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And, like you said earlier, you were really too young, and it wasn't imminent threat that forced you out of Vietnam. But do you have, is there a special reaction that you have given the situation that right now that we're living through? I mean, we live through it vicariously here on this continent, but still it's really horrific. You get to the point where you have to stop looking at the news, I think, at a certain point. But is there any special resonance or any special suffering that you're going through this period of time watching this happen in Ukraine?
Oh yeah, it's interesting whenever there's what my mother I remember one time we were looking at footage of a horrible earthquake in Haiti. Was it 2008? And she said, "Oh, it looks like war destructions." And so yeah, I think that those scenes of um, destruction, obviously with force that's human, not natural, um, that's organized and targeted. It does bring up uh, those kinds of war terrors, that those are associated with in one's recent generational memory. um so like when that was happening last year in Palestine, it's there's so many occasions where these types of aggressions um, happen, and it's always the most vulnerable that suffer the most, which is also why I was interested in my book to center the stories of women um, and children. you know um, in a way, it's a certain perspective, I think, in the book that's from a perspective of myself growing up in the shadow of all of that, which was a haunting too in the US for US Americans who weren't from Vietnam, who had served in Vietnam, in the war in Vietnam. So those and the kinds of what does Viet Minh say? It's that the war is the second time that it's fought is in memory. So there's also ways in which there's this a war inside the imaginary that's at play. And I wonder sometimes if the fatigue that we share, when you talk about is having to look away, isn't about that form of protectionism, but it does draw me into thinking about how important it is to narrate our most like human responses to it. Just the other day, someone was asking me about teaching poetry. That's something that I like to do, teaching creative writing specifically and looking at poems. And they asked me what poem, do I bring in or have I brought in? And for like an introduction for an undergraduate situation. And the poem I thought of was Dulce et Decorum Est by Wilfred Owen, who, of course, was working through his PTSD, writing this poem about the event of chemical warfare, and seeing a comrade die in front of him. And then as a refusal of Horace's, it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. And so I think about, so the poetry's responses to these occasions and how our imaginary is a powerful way to consider freeing content, freeing our thinking.
My friend Amalio Madueño, poet in Taos, New Mexico, says that chemical weapons treats people like insects, which really puts it into perspective. Sing Ding Ghostly, page 31, is more of that rich personal myth that I alluded to in the introduction. The Hoa referenced is not you in that poem.
No, there's other kinds of ghosts in the book, including, yes, children that my mother had before I was born. One was a daughter who was named, who had my name before me, who she was the original Hoa. Yeah, and so I invoke her. I don't have any photos of her, and I know just a little about her. But of course, that's a different kind of haunting. That's also personal, to have the ghost girl's name. Do you have the page number for that poem handy?
Yes, that's on page 31.
Thank you. Sing Ding Ghostly. Where is she buried? The first Hoa, gone to ground, buried in Mekong mud, dead unknown years, drowned in lung matter. The first Hoa had not medicine. I got it, the medicine, and got the golden visa and the ash hair and breathings, lashings to a raft life, lashed to life, the blonde joke of pull eyes. Mother swims from the nest, pushes sand first, scrapes flat flipper feet. We come from egg and make it, are the lived lung loved thing. Cracked leather egg from dragon fairy mating, left warm in warm sand. She buried the nest us as nest so we could unbury, gulp sand, few kin in the sand. We seek under beached beach, moon beach, the moon water beach. This isn't doing anything like redemption, do dad, mountain dragon, unsuffering, did slither to sea ways. Who are you to talk tits and knee shame? Sing ding dong songs at me, boys. I called it unsufferable, said, I'll meet her in heaven where the perfume is. I say, I'll meet you there. Qua.
I'll meet her in heaven where the perfume is. Oh my God. Fantastic. My mother lost a child before I was born. At 8 months, she said the baby just stopped kicking. It was a girl. So another powerful resonance for me
Mm.
when I read your work. What advice would you give for someone who wants to move into a more serial approach to writing poems, who wants to look at it from a project? And, you know, writing a mother book, a book about your mom, is such a beautiful thing. And it would seem to me very difficult. Although I would love to do that on some level. And I don't think there's enough mother poems. That'd be a good anthology. There probably is an anthology of mother poems, but what advice would you have for someone trying to tackle more of a serial approach, who make that shift to a serial approach?
I think that thinking investigatively is one way, journalistically, with a lot of heart. Um, I think I like the term gathering um, because it feels generous. Like it's not just about I don't know, something hard and fact files or something like that. But I do appreciate the something that Ed Sanders said about arranging or being, his interest in, writing biographies in verse and telling histories in verse is, he's talked about arranging strips. And he also talked about, the saturation draw, which is after Olson as well. So to dig one thing, for a while. Um,
Data clusters.
Data clusters, exactly. Those are really useful ways to think about it. I've also been interested in thinking about it from terms or vantages that feel um, I think I used the word generous earlier. So sometimes I'm thinking through like how could I learn about seriality, from plant life or a particular plant, or geode formation. Um, those are other forms of intelligence that pattern, that elaborate, that are part of a process. I think of writing in a serial form is a way to also think about how you can move your content with language, um, with this sort of more open idea of it as being a process. Because I think one of the things that kept hooking me and preventing me from seeing the book to its completion is I think a kind of colonial outlook on the archive, and I really wanted to break that out. I wanted to have it be more mythic in its shape, or um, take on these other dimensions. So I think, in terms of writing a series, to really think of it as a process, as this larger linked space of correspondences. When I went to write A Thousand Times You Lose Your Treasure, I talked to Anne Waldman about writing an epic, since she's an epic writer herself. And she said the idea of having sort of like a returning image was an important feature for her, an imago. And that actually it started with Chen, the hexagram for the thunder, chaos, shock. And then it became the expression of the tower from the tarot, which then also became emblem inside of the poems. And I recognized that it included, and I meant to say this when you were mentioning the different kind of clock towers, is one of my like first jobs when I lived in Austin, Texas. When I started working for the University of Texas, is I was hired to inaugurate the opening of the structure that's their symbol, their university clock tower, which had been closed for 25 years and had this shadow of a sniper massacre behind it that happened in 1966. And that timestamp for me too was like, oh, that corresponded too with thinking about the period of time that my mother was living through. And then, of course, it is a tower. And then, of course, also the tower card was the card I pulled before I went to Vietnam for the first time. And I was really nervous about it. And this was in part like of my, writing of the book was to go to Vietnam. I actually went to Hanoi instead of South Vietnam, because um, I was doing a workshop in Hanoi, and that's where my contacts were. The small press Ajar, who does bilingual work, contemporary Vietnamese and American diasporic Vietnamese poetries. And the tower card was something I was really worried about. But then when I got there was nothing tower-like about it. It was all really quite interesting and introspective. And then I met a lovely group of people. But one day, as part of an outing I was taking with people I had met, we wandered into a park, and it was at the end of Tet, which is the big holiday. And so all the families were out. It was a Sunday, and they had all these different things set up for children, including like a little carousel and a train. And then I saw and heard actually a loudspeaker and someone's voice saying something over and over again. And I asked my guests what they were saying, and they said, oh, well, there's a motorcycle act over here where they ride on the side of a cylinder. And so I was like, that was what my mother used to do. So I had wandered into the park at the moment where this visiting motorcycle act had set up, and I got to see this act, and then talked to my mom through Skype that evening to tell her that I had stumbled upon it. But when I finished watching the performance and I came back down and I was documenting it, and I realized that the structure looks like a tower because it's a cylinder and it has the canvas big top at the top of it. So it was sort of like a visual joke that the tarot was telling me, but also the synchronicity of it blew me away, and I was left with the feeling of shock. So
When you decide on a certain project and there are certain key images that come through, it's been my experience that things tend to just fall into your lap, and that's an example of that.
yes.
Yeah. Your mom died in 2019, and the book came out after her death, right? Yeah, what, two years later? You obviously had poems going back many years. What did your mom think about the poems in this book?
I was so lucky. She actually got to see me perform from poems in this book. I was brought to the University of Maryland, and that's where I had gone as an undergrad. My mother still lived in my childhood home, and she was in hospice at the time. So I was going there a lot. And so she came to the performance, and I read from the manuscript, including poems that I had at that time that included these aspects of her life. And then at the end, as the finale, I was able to have them project the 4 images from her motorcycle days, which brought the house down. She had heard the poems before. Particularly, there's a poem that tells the story of how she was named Diep. And I read that poem to her both on that night and then previously, after which she said, after hearing me read, that she felt that I had remembered her life more than she did, better than she did. So that was really special for me to hear from her, and she was really happy after the performance at the University of Maryland. She was beaming and said, "I am famous," talking about herself. But also she saw that, I was up on the stage, with the audience, and selling my books afterwards to the students. And she thought that was pretty neat. She thought it was pretty cool that I was writing about her, because she was like an ordinary person.
Oh, she's badass, not an ordinary person.
True.
People, I mean, I could maybe ride my bike when I used to be able to ride my bike with no hands. After the crash, my bike's not the same, but a motorcycle on the handlebar, you see that picture and you're going, holy shit. I couldn't even think of doing that. And it's amazing. And it looks so natural. It looks like she's surfing in one of those pictures. Is there a poem that you like to end on, or would you like me to? I have one in mind, but viewed from 2020 on page 90, or Sings the Wishing Well on page 96, or maybe is one that you like to close with to end our, we've been going for over an hour, so it's probably a good time to close the interview.
Oh, I love your choices. Let's go with that second poem. It's towards the end of the book too. The Wishing Well poem.
96, yeah.
Yeah. Sings the wishing well, the ghost well cared for. In the story, the men get to live. The wife, faithful, dies. Her death is pious. Strangled stars bangle. Gather floating flowers. Underworld yourself. A beautiful dreamer in the mosquito myth, with visions of owning a grand house. She grows ill in the fields and dies, is arrayed in a field of flowers, saved by blood magic. She later betrays, doomed to live as nuisance, begging, begging. Don't go, again I call, newly flooded fields of rice. Farm girl sits on the flood wall, sings the wishing well. We sing her story beyond time, wield feathers and clouds of her, a melted floating love gem, our tears mix with tears. I have no sacred rites for you, saving the sacred grove you grew.
You used the word generosity, and it struck me at that time that there's a huge generosity of spirit in your work. And I'm grateful to have had this experience, to talk to you about it, to get to know it better, and to allow other people to get to know your work better. And I'm very grateful. Thank you for your time today and your brilliant responses to my questions.
Thank you so much. It's been such a deep pleasure, Paul.